Good morning, everybody. As you are probably by this time aware, my name is Brian Dalrymple, and this workshop is intended to deal with the issues of the forensic light source, the history of it, the evolution, the extensions that have come along in the timeline, and finally some recommendations on acquisition. And I want to make one thing clear from the beginning. This is not about recommending or supporting any particular brand or product, but what it is meant to do is talk generically about the different properties of the light sources, what they do, some of the handling issues, advantages and disadvantages, and I guess allow people to make an informed decision about which light source or light sources they choose to acquire. We spend our time in this business looking at very small things. In fact, a lot of us have spent our careers looking at a square, about 1.5 inches square. We tend to focus on macro. The details are very important to us. But I think it's important from time to time to stand back and start to, while maintaining that focus, look at the overall picture and how that changes and how what we're doing at any given time relates to that overall picture, but at the same time keeping our focus on the thing that does matter to us in our daily work. So that's, in a sense, what I'm trying to do here today. We have undergone an evolutionary process from the late 70s, and we tend to forget some of the milestones along the way. And I think you're going to see as we go on in this process during the day that those can be very, very important. And they will impact on our decisions. So let's take a look a little bit of the, at a little bit of the history. This process started for me in 1976. And I call it Serendipity 76 because, like a lot of things that happen in our business, it was pure accident. It was a happy stumbling, if you like. And it started with a job when I was pretty new on the job for the Ontario Provincial Police as a forensic analyst. And it's difficult, and I kind of think that with possibly a couple of exceptions in the crowd, I may be the one who's been around in this business, if not the longest, certainly as long as anybody here. I started in 1971. So I've seen a fair bit of progress, a fair bit of change in the business in that period of time. So in 1976, I had received a drug case which consisted of approximately 100 small black cardboard boxes. Very cheap cardboard, that gray kind of recycled look of cardboard that had shiny black overprinting on it. And in 1976, there was only one real reagent for paper, and that was ninhydrin. And it was spanking new at the time. It had just basically replaced silver nitrate. But the one thing about that was both of those techniques are staining techniques. And while ninhydrin has been a bread and butter technique for me during my entire career, that's one real shortcoming of it, that it doesn't work on dark surfaces. You simply can't see whatever it was the ninhydrin might have been able to develop. So I started casting around looking for something else to take the place of ninhydrin, and one of my colleagues had recently developed a kind of a groundbreaking procedure for finding fingerprints on human skin involving iodine silver plate transfer. So iodine was fresh in my mind, and I thought if we could fume the impressions, if I could somehow get them to respond to iodine, transfer them to a silver plate, then the black background is not going to be an issue. So I tried that and found that I wasn't getting any results at all. And then I thought, well, I better find out if there is something inherently wrong with this thinking, if this technique is not going to work. So I took one of the exhibits and took a very fresh, greasy print and put it onto the surface, and for reasons beyond my comprehension, it didn't work at all. So I thought, there's something wrong here with the transfer. Something's not happening as far as the transfer from the substrate to the plate. So then, being a photographer, having 3 years of college photography behind me, I thought about the idea perhaps of fluorescence. Maybe we can cause this to fluoresce. And we're going to talk more about this as we get into it, but basically the idea of fluorescence is you bombard a component or a chemical with light of one wavelength, then there is light absorption, a shift in the molecular structure, and it re-emits light of a different wavelength. So if we could do this, it would mean we wouldn't have to worry about an actual transfer. We could photograph it in situ. So this is where the serendipity comes into it. A fellow named James Duff, who happened to be a neighbor of mine, was a small particle chemist at the Xerox Research Center in Mississauga, where I lived, just outside Toronto. And he had extensive knowledge of particle properties, their response to light, and he was also my fishing buddy. So we talked about this. We got permission from our respective bosses to, I guess you could say, play together for a while. And out of that, we found through the literature that, in fact, someone had induced iodine to fluoresce in 1911. And we had a bit of a rush at that because we thought, well, we're on the edge of something good here. Well, it turns out that what they were able to do in 1911, we were not able to do effectively for this purpose in 1976. Very important reason for that. It's called Stokes shift. So iodine has what is called a very short Stokes shift, which means there's very, very little difference in terms of the distance on the spectrum between the points at which it absorbs light and the point at which it emits light, and therefore it's impossible to have a filter efficient or effective enough to block that and therefore view any fluorescence the iodine is putting out. So that was a bit of a downer. Then I turned to a book written by a colleague of the day, a friend named Robert Olson Sr., who put out a redone book called Scott's Fingerprint Mechanics. And he had a great section in that book, very interesting section in the book, on the ingredients of perspiration. And it was the first time in my career I'd basically had that close a look at actually what was in perspiration in terms of the target ingredients, in terms of the diversity and so on. And we just sort of started thinking, with all that stuff, would there be something in there that would fluoresce all on its own? So we started pursuing that angle of things, and Jim introduced me to a colleague of his, Roland Menzel, who was a physicist doing picosecond spectroscopy, which is a mouthful, and he had a laser. And we started doing some experiments together, and Roland smiled when we talked about this because he said, spectroscopists have known for years that you have to exercise care in handling thin layer chromatography plates because fingerprints can cause fluorescent noise. So this is another part of the serendipity coming into the picture. And finally, in terms of serendipity, when you work with high-powered mainframe lasers, you must wear protective goggles. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. I'm sure everybody here is well aware of that. But I can tell you that in 1976, this was a very new issue to me, and particularly important because the slightest lapse in procedure can result in blindness. So the serendipity part is that in addition to protecting the eyes from this very bright, very dangerous light, the goggles also blocked the reflected light from the laser but allowed the transmission of the fluorescence it caused. And it was a new world. It was like an epiphany to see that we actually do live in a fluorescing world. There's fluorescence going on all around us as we speak here. We just haven't set up the situation in order to see it. So if you take a Bic lighter and you stand on the beach at Waikiki at high noon and you flick your lighter, chances are the only way you're going to know if that lighter is actually on is by putting your hand over the top. You're not going to see the flame. But if you then go to a darkened theater at night, all the windows and doors blocked, you're in absolute black darkness, and you do the same thing at center stage, your eyes acclimatize, and it's absolutely amazing what you see. So the secret to all of this, it's so obvious in a way that I think a lot of it gets overlooked in terms of expedience in our everyday application, but when you set the circumstances up to the optimum, it's amazing how much that lighter will light. So in terms of the serendipity again, it was a happy accident to stumble into the fact that fluorescence can occur, and then also that the goggles that are meant for safety, they were never intended for viewing fluorescence or photographing fluorescence, but they actually filled that role very nicely. About the same time, I'm thinking it was about November of 1976, I was approached by a colleague in the RCMP who had a case, a drug case, involving a piece of black electric tape. And on the sticky side of the tape, which had been used to secure a package of drugs, he could see in sort of 3 dimensions where a finger had touched, right on the very end of it. But in that time, there was no real technique for getting fingerprints on the sticky side of black electric tape, or I think for that matter, any kind of tape. Long before sticky side powder, long before gentian violet. So he called me and said, "Is there anything else we can do?" And I said, "Funny you should ask, because right now we are working on a new project which exploits native or intrinsic fluorescence." And I'm going to mention it as we go on again, but we shouldn't forget the impact of this. This was not a laser technique. Laser was how we got there, but this has to do with using fluorescence as a detection approach. And it's really the first time in our business that has been done effectively. I remember when I was working with my first boss in the early 70s, and he was a great gadget guy. And the first thing he did was buy every fingerprint powder that one manufacturer produced. We had Dragon's Blood, we had Mars Red, we had everything in between. There must have been 35 or 40 little jars of powder on the shelf. And they had a protective sleeve around them of plastic, you know, the security seal. And when I retired, some of them were still there unopened, and the white plastic seal had yellowed and in some cases cracked with age because they'd never been used. Some of those were fluorescent powders, and the only time the fluorescent powders were used was for tours, and they would exhibit fluorescence under ultraviolet, and it was great to show school kids and the media a pretty picture. But in terms of practical, operational application, there simply wasn't any use in our business of fluorescence at that time. So I took possession of this piece of tape, got permission from Xerox, who were incredibly accommodating, to take it out and use their laser to examine. So the 3 of us, Jim Duff, Roland Menzel, and myself, were actually hovered over the laser like fathers outside a maternity ward. And when the lights went out and the laser went on, we saw an extremely faint area of orange fluorescence on the end of that tape. You couldn't say it was a fingerprint. There was no apparent sign of ridge detail there, but it was enough to get us excited. So we had to try to photograph this thing. And this was a first. Never done it before. And when we did that, we found how weak this fluorescence was. The film I was using at the time, this is back in the film world, or era, was 100 ASA, as we said in those days, or ISO. And the optimum exposure for that turned out to be f8 at 40 minutes. So we basically opened the lens, left the laser on, went to lunch, and came back and closed the lens. And for those of you who may have some experience in the era of film photography, you may remember a phrase called reciprocity failure. And of course that means that the effective speed of your film plummets in very, very long exposures. So we did an exposure also at 80 minutes because this was a blind search. You don't get instant gratification by looking on the back of your camera the way we do today. So while we're there on that same piece of film, we had two exposures, f8 at 40 minutes and f8 at 80 minutes. And to see the difference between the 40-minute and the 80-minute exposure, you would need a densitometer, because it is absolutely astounding the degree to which your film speed drops on those long exposures. As an example of that, who in the room is a runner? Anybody here is a runner?
I was.
How long would it take you to run a mile on your best day?
I don't know. I practice, but I don't know exact time.
Let's say 8 minutes. So we know that Diego can run a mile in 8 minutes. So all we have to do, if we want to find out how long it takes him to run from here to San Francisco, is multiply the number of miles by 8 minutes. Well, of course, that doesn't work. The reciprocal breaks down. And no one can do that. And the film has that same problem, that what works on the short term doesn't work in the long term. So instead of having film that's 100 ASA, you have film that's maybe 0.05 ASA. And I'm just fishing for numbers here, but that's the kind of progression you get. So you actually get very, very little increase in density per unit of exposure the way you do in the normal operating range of the camera. So when we developed this film, we found an absolutely beautiful print, and I can't tell you what that day was like. That was one of the signature days of my career, to see the detail on that film when we processed it. And again, this is where the serendipity comes in. Not only was this the first time, not only was that print not available by any other technique, but it was also a criminal identification. And this was the first case in history of using inherent fluorescence to identify a fingerprint. First case of laser application, and the first time fluorescence was actually a serious tool. So something started that day. And that's what the tape looked like. You may, if you have very, very good eyes, or even better, if you have a good imagination, on the original couple of generations ago, there was some detail you could see of the three-dimensional nature of the print on the back of that tape. But I'm afraid because of subsequent generational loss and the very necessary lighting here, you can't really see that. But under the laser, and once again, this has a certain amount of generational loss. But one of the trademarks or characteristics of fluorescent ridge detail, particularly that which is inherent in nature, that is untreated, the resolution is usually really good because you haven't sort of messed things up by adding powder or extra chemical. You haven't had to build on the ridge sites. What's there is there, and you're seeing it in a native way. So once again, no previous light exploitation. And I think you may be able to appreciate the ripple effect this had in my police department as well as in the Xerox Research Center. And once again, I have to say that they were absolutely fantastic corporate citizens in their support of our project. So UV powder, as I said, UV fluorescent powder was not effective. I've been told since, I'm not a chemist, but Jim tells me that the molecule is just simply too big to be an effective fingerprint powder. So it had great fluorescent properties, but it had lousy adherent properties as a powder. It's kind of like a sea anchor. The powder has to drag around this fluorescent component to it, and it's not nearly as effective, efficient, and preferential as your standard black or gray powders are, because their function is to A, adhere to the fingerprint, B, not adhere to the substrate, and C, offer significant contrast between the two. So you simply can't get that, or couldn't get that, I should say, at the time with the existing fluorescent powders that responded to UV. So it was a new direction in fingerprint detection. And this is a critical thing to understand. When we talk about absorption reflection, that's how we see our world. I see, for example, that the white cards with your names on them are reflecting by far the greater percentage of the light that falls on them. And it's doing so evenly across the spectrum. So because the light that's coming back is essentially the white light that is hitting them, I see that as white. On the other hand, Leslie has a sweater on that's black, and it is absorbing by far the greatest percentage of the light falling on it, but it's also doing so pretty much evenly across the spectrum, so we see that as black. And then Anthony's wearing a blue shirt, so that is absorbing the green and the red pretty much simplistically, absorbing the green and the red and reflecting the blue light, so we see color in this way. But what we have to remember is when we look at the world by absorption and reflection, we have what is called a fixed dynamic range. And I can read Amanda's name on the card very easily because it's black against white. And as long as we have that kind of dynamic range, it's easy to see. But as the background gets darker and the signal gets lighter, there is much less difference between the two, and then we run into what is called a compressed dynamic range. And once it's properly and uniformly lit at the optimum, you can't change the dynamic range by adding to the amount of light hitting it, because you're getting the same amount, the same proportions reflected as you are absorbed, no matter how much light you throw at it. So this is called a fixed dynamic range, and it has limitations. It fulfills an important part of our job. It still does. Fingerprint powder is still a huge part of the job, and so are other staining techniques. But what they have is called a fixed dynamic range. Nothing absorbs 100% of incident light, and nothing reflects 100% of incident light. So your fixed dynamic range falls somewhere there in the middle. Even though Leslie's sweater is black, we can see the fold lines. There is modeling there. So it's not black as such. It's a very, very dark gray. So we have this fixed dynamic range. And we have to remember, too, that fingerprints are composed of sub-nanogram amounts of material, typically. So that's less than a billionth of a gram of material, which is not very much stuff. And also, the target component, whatever that might be, is a percentage of that. So if we're trying to optimize our ability to detect that, then we need to exploit whatever technique we can use, whatever approach we can use to its maximum. In the concept of luminescence or fluorescence, I guess I should make the distinction there. Luminescence is when something absorbs light and then re-emits light, or light that is generated by some means other than heat. So we're not talking about incandescence here. We're talking about light that is formed as a result of some other phenomenon. So we have chemiluminescence with fireflies, or with luminol, where light is the product of a chemical reaction. We have thermoluminescence, where slight, not incandescence, not that kind of heat, but very, very slight heat applied to certain minerals will cause them to exhibit luminescence. We have a thing called triboluminescence, which is when you break the crystal structure of a material like sugar, it gives off energy in the form of light. And this is kind of a cocktail party trick you might make $10 on in a bet, but if you have a wintergreen lifesaver and you crunch down on it with your mouth open in the dark, you'll see sparks. And that is triboluminescence. But the most important one to us, of course, is photoluminescence. That is light caused by light. And the important thing about this, the crux of this whole day really, is the fact that luminescence as a detection approach is exponentially more sensitive than staining something. And that's really the whole nutshell of the thing. Because here we don't want any reflected incident light getting back to our eyes or to the camera when we choose to record something. So when we look at the luminescence of a fingerprint and the luminescence of a substrate, they're variable. It's not linked, it's not fixed as it is when we are using an absorption reflection approach. So there's a much wider potential dynamic range involved in this approach. Much more sensitive. Here's an example from an early case, and this is one we may run into a little bit of an issue with, but here we have a case from our post office. An employee of the post office was responsible for receiving payment for delivery of what I used to call junk mail. I think the clients wouldn't like that reference, but there you are. If you owned a pizza parlor and you wanted your flyers distributed on a particular route, you would go in and you would pay this guy $9 per route at that time, and then he would see that your flyers got distributed, and he would enter that information on one of those Pitney Bowes postal meters, which you probably remember have the little lead seal on them so nobody can tamper with them. And you would get a little piece of meter tape which reflected that, that exchange. Well, this employee was a bit of a nonlinear thinker, also in need of a second income. So what he would do is collect the $9, and then he would punch in a void, an asterisk 00, which is a void, and it's not registered internally on the meter, but he would get a piece of meter tape, and then he would take the date stamp and very accidentally just have the stamp over top of the first digit. So you can sort of see the 0 here, and then you can see where the date stamp comes in. And just to be absolutely sure, then he would finish the job with a permanent marker, just daub it on that place so it was completely blocked out. And you may think this is a little Mickey Mouse, $9, but you do that enough times, and he had a very nice second income. So if we look at this in the absorption reflection mode, we have an extremely compressed dynamic range. Very, very little difference, if any, between the lightest and the darkest tone in what we're looking at. And if you apply Photoshop, we have a lighter area in the center where we have tried to expand that range with levels, but we're still not seeing anything. So now if we take a look at the luminescent or the fluorescent image, can you see the two zeros here? It's hard for me from this angle, but if you can see that. Can anybody see anything at all in that blacked out area? Now we're going to, again, we come back. This is kind of good because it's a graphic illustration of how important it is to set up the correct viewing situation to see discrete differences in fluorescence. So here we can see the asterisk. Can everybody see that, first of all, I should say? I know I'm putting a bias in your minds, but nobody's going to court on this, so that's okay. Okay, so we're going to take a look again at what we were doing at Xerox. And this comes on the heels as well of my former supervisor's work on using iodine silver plate transfer to get fingerprints on skin. So the obvious question was, is it possible, could we use this technique to find fingerprints on skin? That was on everybody's mind at that time. And we didn't want to, or at least our aim at that time was not to say this is something that is going to become operational or can happen, but we just wanted to see if it was possible. So we actually photographed fingerprint on living skin, and we were able to both see it and photograph it, but that was immediately after deposition. And that is my fingerprint on Roland Menzel's arm. And again, it was a very exciting day because regardless of whether or not it was something that was going to happen every second Tuesday, at least we could say, yes, it is possible. And at that point in time, my police department became operational in doing bodies for fingerprints. And we became the designated provider of that service for our province. And during that that period, I guess for quite a long time, we were doing body examinations for police forces both in Ontario, across Canada, the United States, and the Caribbean.
Brian, quick question.
Yes.
This is actually on the skin. This is not a transfer method and then using the laser?
That is untreated right on the surface of the skin. So I basically put my fingerprint on Roland's arm like that, and then he laid his arm on the table, and we brought the camera in and photographed it.
What wavelength was it?
Good question. Good question. And that's something that we are going to be talking about more as we go along. We sort of use a basket word. We talk about lasers as though they were all the same. But what we were doing in those days was using a tunable argon ion laser. And an argon ion laser has the ability to put out quite a range of wavelengths, but they're all in the blue and the green. And I'm not sure exactly, but 95% or so is between two wavelengths, 514.5 nanometers and 488 nanometers. And we were using single line at 514.5 for this one. That's a great question. So again, with the fingerprints on skin, we had some suppositions. We had some anticipated outcomes, if you like. We thought the body begins the catabolic process, decay at death, decomposition, so you're going to have a limited window of opportunity. The fingerprints on skin are very fragile. They're vulnerable to time, temperature, humidity. We didn't feel that this was going to be feasible on living skin because we know that the skin is a living organism. It's constantly in the metabolic process throwing stuff off, which is going to tend to water down or or dilute or obscure whatever might have been left behind by the donor. So we didn't see it as a technique for living skin, and we felt also that we were talking about smooth, hairless skin. And that's something that is all too unfortunately and tragically true, because in all of our victim homicides, and we're talking here about usually sexually motivated homicides, we're talking about young children or females. So typically, that's the kind of skin you're looking at. This was our first laser. So remember my suppositions, our suppositions about what to expect. We felt we had a very limited opportunity as far as fingerprints. So, bit of a interesting story. We had those of you, well, you all work for government organizations, so perhaps you can empathize with this. When governments get their budgets, austerity and frugality is preached in the beginning, and then 3 months before the end of the fiscal year, I see heads nodding already, we have what I used to call Cinderella money. They would say, after the previous 9 months of austerity, they would say, there's 30 grand in the budget. Is there anything you guys need? But you got to have it in, delivered, on site, money committed before the end of the fiscal year, or it disappears like the pumpkin. Turns back into a pumpkin. So, 2 things happened to direct my department's attention towards us in terms of this available money. It may just be a coincidence, but our fiscal year ended on April Fool's Day. And somewhere around the Christmas time, we had already had the first case in history. We actually should have stopped right then because we were batting 1,000. But we had the first case where a fingerprint had been detected, photographed, and identified by virtue of intrinsic fluorescence. And that really was an important milestone, so my department was very, very supportive of the project. Anyway, we had, this is why I know exactly when we had our laser. We were operational just prior to April 1st, 1977. And our paper had come out in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in January of '77, so there was quite a bit of interest at that point. And we had a couple of visitors from the FBI. And I'm thinking maybe Ken might know the name, and perhaps a couple of the others in the group as well. A fellow named George Bonebreak. George came with another fellow to evaluate the laser, and brought a colleague with him. And I remember this day very clearly, because Toronto in July and August can be very much like Tampa in July and August. High heat, high humidity, sitting right on top of the lake there. One of those days when they came, you know, the kind of day when you put your arm on your desk and when you lift your arm, all your papers are stuck to your arm. Terrible day. In fact, the reason I remember mostly is because they had sent everybody home early that day. A heat humidity day. So, we were the only people in the building. And George and his colleague were putting their hands under the laser with various pieces of plastic and metal and paper and so on. And I noticed that on one of his hands, there was a bright fluorescent mark. So I actually grabbed his hand and looked at it, and there was a fingerprint on his right hand here that I could classify. And I'm not exaggerating. It was an absolutely crisp, clean, perfect whorl pattern. And there were 3 more little marks on the back of his hand here. And so, shaking hands. Another very exciting day. So this fingerprint was classifiable. Now, with what I know now, this is certainly contamination. This is not intrinsic or something that he has sweated out. But who cares? Operationally, it makes no difference. In terms of research, in terms of expectation, certainly it makes a difference, but not in terms of the demonstrative value of that impression. And I actually said to George, I said, don't take this the wrong way, but if someone had strangled you instead of shaking your hand, we would have had great evidence. And there's the print. Now, this is a lousy print. Even with the lights off, this is a lousy print. But the reason for that was George had to get a flight. All we could do was take a color Polaroid shot at the time, and he held his hand steady for 30 seconds. It was just a quick, and like, who knew? We didn't realize, if I'd known the value, the importance of it at the time, I probably would have told him to cancel his flight and do it right. But at any rate, you can see the brightness of it. And what we saw was, again, crisp, clear, second-level detail. So we look at, we look at my expectations, my anticipated results. We said before, we thought before, that we were going to need smooth, hairless skin. This is a man in his 60s, and he had quite a bit of hair on the back of his hand. We thought we were going to need optimum heat and humidity conditions for this to happen, and we certainly didn't get that. We thought that we were going to have a window of opportunity of perhaps an hour, or not too much more than that, and we absolutely fingerprinted everybody that he could have shaken hands with by the time he got off the plane, and there was a period of about 10 hours there that we went back in time, and it wasn't anybody there. And believe me, the comparison was easy. Even with the poor quality of the somewhat blurry representation. What you see here is something that has lost in generations. It's like doing a Xerox copy of a Xerox copy, and so on. But the original, actually, the detail was far, far better than what you could see here, even though it was blurry from subject movement. So that one stayed with us, and that was also a contributing factor to us becoming operational, to adding to our protocol a light examination along with the iodine silver plate examination. Let's take a break.